Good morning, guys. Welcome back from spring break. I hope you guys enjoyed your week and a half, getting to spend time with your family. Hopefully, maybe you guys went on an Easter egg hunt or something like that, got some Easter gifts. Hopefully, you had a good time and you guys were able to relax and enjoy yourselves. But now it's back to work. We have a month and a half left of school. This is the last push until the end of the school year. Hopefully, fingers crossed that we'll be able to return at some point before the end of the year. But if not, we'll just keep moving and staying positive and moving forward with this online learning. As a quick reminder, tomorrow we are going to have a Zoom session, and then during the Zoom session we can go ahead and check in to see what you guys been up to. And then Friday will be our first live session where we're going to have our first live teaching class, so we can start learning and doing things in real time. I have been trying to do new things with the Google Slides to get us more engaged, so we're going to try it out. It'll be a testing and learning experience, but looking forward to it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the new content for this week. Good morning, 8th grade. So today we are going to start a whole new section, and I'm going to skip around. So we're going to skip to the Industrial Revolution, and this is going to be a time where we start to see like the modern world. And this is like in the 1800s. So one thing that you have to think about while we're doing this is it's pretty crazy that this time in history is an important time in history because everything is going to change after this. The life of the way Americans live, the way we get our resources, the way our economy goes, it's all changing during the 1800s. And it's all due to what we call like the Industrial Revolution, the creation of these new factories and mass producing things. What's crazy is that this happens in the 1800s. Hundreds and hundreds of years ever since then, everything that you had came from your family or you made it yourself. So this is the first time in history that things are going to change, where we're going to make things and start selling it. Before, it wasn't really like that. Everyone made things for themselves. So this is a key part, and this kind of explodes into the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. So today, in the next few days, we are going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, and we'll go ahead and get into that right now. So let's go ahead and start, and we'll learn about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So building background. In the early 1700s, making goods depended on the hard work of humans and animals. It had been that way for hundreds of years. Then new technology brought change, so radical that it's called a revolution. It began in Great Britain and soon spread to the United States. And it's all thanks to this one man who we will talk about in a second. So at the beginning of the 1700s, the majority of the people in Europe and the United States were farmers. Matter of fact, about 80% of the population were farmers and about 20% were craftspeople. Nowadays, after the Industrial Revolution, everything flipped. It turned out to be like only 20% of the people were farmers, and then 80% turned into factory workers. So this is a huge change, and this is why it's so important to us to learn about, and how it had a huge effect not only on the Americas, but on the world, and how everything happens in the world and in the economy. So back then, everything that was made, most of it was made by hand. For example, female family members usually made clothing. First, they would have to get the spinning wheel, they would have to get the materials, they would have to make the cloth, they would have to turn the cloth into thread, and then they would make clothes. Okay? So first they would use a spinning wheel to make cotton, wool, and thread. Then by hand they would make their clothes. I believe in this photo that I'm showing you, these are the shoemakers, and a lot of people, everything was made in their homes. So some families, they actually produce extra cloth to sell to merchants who sold for a profit, but that was very few people. Some towns, they had skilled workers who made goods by hand, and they owned their shops. So some of them included like blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, and their ways of life stayed the same, and it was like this for generation. So if your dad was a blacksmith or your mom was a blacksmith, you would be a blacksmith. And all this changed when the Industrial Revolution got introduced to Britain and eventually spread over here to the Americas. So by the mid-1700s, however, changes in Great Britain led to a greater demand for manufacturing goods. As you know, Britain was always in constant war with different countries, and they needed a lot of goods, and they needed things made and quickly. If you know, back then a lot of things were made by hand, and they just couldn't produce enough because people were just producing it for their families. And if you made extra, you would sell them off. But they needed a new strategy. They needed to come up with new things. So as agriculture and the roads improved, cities, the populations grew, overseas trade expanded, and traditional manufacturing methods did not produce enough to meet the goods, or did not produce enough goods to meet everyone's needs. So they needed to come up with some type of thing. So traditional manufacturing methods, like you produce only what your family needed, it didn't produce enough goods, and they needed to do a change. Because of the population growth and because of all this, they needed to become more efficient. And this is when they started to develop new technologies to decide, or to be used to start this new manufacturing system. So when the people started to create new ways to use machines and to make things more efficient and to produce mass quantities of things, this led to what we call the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution, there was actually two of them. This is the first Industrial Revolution. In this Industrial Revolution, it was a period of rapid growth using machines for manufacturing and production that begun in the mid 1700s. Nowadays, we are so used to this manufacturing and the way they produce things that it's normal for us. But back then, this was life-changing and game-changing. And as you see the picture, it did start with kids working in these factories, which we'll talk about, I believe, tomorrow. So the first important breakthrough of the Industrial Revolution took place, however, in the area of textiles or cloth making items. So right there, you're gonna see that is one of the first machines. That's what we call the water frame, and I'll tell you exactly how it works in a second. Okay. So before the Industrial Revolution, spinning thread took a lot more time than making the cloth. Several workers needed to spin enough thread to supply a huge weaver. So everything was made. You had to get the cotton plant, you had to like fine it down, you would have to get each thread, twist it into a thread, and then you would make the cloth. So it just took a lot of time to do this, and it wasn't efficient. And if you can imagine, there are still people to this day that still make things, cloth by hand, and it's just time consuming. So in 1769, an Englishman, his name was Richard Arkwright, he invented what we call the first large spinning machine called the water frame, which you see right there. And the water frame, the reason why they called it the water frame is because it was water powered. Okay, so this water frame could produce dozens of cotton threads at the same time, and it pretty much what it did, it lowered the cost of cotton cloth and increased the speed of making textiles or making this cloth. The water frame, it used flowing water as its source of power, so merchants began to build large textile mills or factories near rivers and streams. So most of these factories that were being built were built by waters, like lakes or rivers and streams, because everything was water powered. These mills were filled with spinning machines, and merchants began hiring people to work in the mills. Additionally, improvements also speeded up the process. Britain soon had the world's first productive textile manufacturing industry, and we are actually going to get some tips from them, and they're going to show us how to use it secretly. So the way the water pump worked was, just think of it as like a water or a windmill, like you see like at Disneyland or at Knott's Berry Farm. You see those big huge water wheels that spin, and when they spin, the current goes through and it actually spins all other things. So that's kind of like how they started to use these water mills or the water pumps. Just think of like having a pinwheel. When the wind blows it, it spins. That's exactly how the water frame worked. The water would go through these frames or through the pinwheel thing. It would spin the wheel, which would cause everything else to spin. So back then, everything was powered by water, and that was like the first breakthrough in the Industrial Revolution. So today we talked about the water frame. We also talked about the need for the Industrial Revolution. Remember, the whole need of this Industrial Revolution was because population was growing, cities were improving, mass production was needed. Before then, everything was made by hand and made within families. So if you needed a pair of shoes, your mom or your dad would make shoes, or maybe your neighbor knew how to make them and they would make them for you. But as everything increased, the demand for these goods needed to increase. So they started to use these different machines and inventions to try to speed up the process. And eventually, this led to the Industrial Revolution, where there's just a rapid growth and a rapid increase of productivity. The first industry to be affected was the textile industry, the clothing industry, and they used this thing called the water frame, which was invented by Richard Arkwright, and everything was water powered. The water would flow through the rivers, and it would spin these wheels, which would spin everything else. So most of these factories were built by rivers or streams because everything was water powered. Because of this, it lowered the cost of the cotton cloth and increased the speed, because now with the machines working, you don't really have to hire people to make these threads, so the cost can go down and the productivity would go up. Okay, so when they started to do this, they started to build these factories and mills, and this was just the beginning and the launch of that something that's going to change the whole world and how we see life, which is the Industrial Revolution. Everything that we have to this day is manufactured, and it's only possible thanks to the Industrial Revolution. So that was a quick review for today. So for homework, I want you to answer these questions. And when you're answering these questions, try to use some of your background knowledge of what you know about the Industrial Revolution, or what you just know about in general. So number one, how did machines speed up textile manufacturing? So how did the machines speed up this cloth making process, or the manufacturing of it? Number two, in what ways might life for workers change as the Industrial Revolution happens? So think, most people are making things by hand. How are the lives of people going to change? And number three, what was the result of increased demand for manufacturing goods in Great Britain? So because everybody needed more demands of goods, what did it cause for these manufacturers in Great Britain? What did it lead to? Okay. So that was our short lesson for today, just the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Like I said, this is a really important time in not only American history, but world history, because it's going to change the way everything happens in this world. And now you can see the world is all about manufacturing, and it's one of the biggest causes of pollution in the world, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to message me. Looking forward to seeing you guys all tomorrow in our Zoom session, so we can catch up to see what you guys did over spring break. But if you have any questions, let me know. And just to remind you, we are going to start to do a lot of live classes, because I think we need to get into that. Just to have more interaction. So starting Friday, we'll have our first one, and I think next week, since you guys are in my homeroom, I want to have at least 3 or 4 live classes every single week, just so we can get interacting, because I think it'll be better for us in the learning process, and we can still build that community that we have. With that being said, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow.